The room smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers. Maya stood at the foot of the bed, her wedding ring still cold on her finger, 3 hours old, and the man she had just married was somewhere she could not reach. His chest rose and fell with the help of machines. Monitors beeped in slow, indifferent rhythms. Outside the window of the private hospital suite, the city of Chicago moved through its Tuesday afternoon like nothing had happened. Like a woman had not just signed her name next to a man in a coma and become his wife against every instinct she had ever trusted. She was 26 years old. She had $43 in her checking account, and she had just married one of the wealthiest men in the country because his family had told her, very clearly, very quietly, that if she did not, her father would lose everything. The house, the business, the savings, all of it. Gone. And so, Maya Chen stood in that hospital room in a dress she had bought from a consignment shop for $38, holding a bouquet of flowers no one had thought to put in water, and she looked at the man lying in that bed and thought one thing. Wake up. Not because she wanted him to, but because she needed this nightmare to have a face. If that opening made something tighten in your chest, stay right here, because this story goes somewhere you absolutely did not see coming. And if you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now, because Shadowlight Stories finds the real human moments buried inside the lives that look nothing like yours from the outside. You are going to want to be here for what happens next. His name was Daniel Holt, 34 years old, CEO of Holt Capital, a private equity firm that managed close to $4 billion in assets across real estate, technology, and energy. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in business publications but whose face rarely did. Controlled, deliberate. Private in a way that powerful people sometimes are when they have learned that visibility is a liability. He had been in a medically induced coma for 11 days when Maya first walked into that hospital room, the result of a brain hemorrhage caused by a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside the city. His prognosis, according to his doctors, was uncertain. He could wake up in days, he could wake up in months, he might not wake up at all. His family, specifically his mother Eleanor Holt and his older brother Richard, had moved fast the moment Daniel's condition stabilized. Daniel had no spouse, he had no children. And under the terms of the Holt family trust, a document drafted by Daniel's grandfather decades ago and never updated, a single man who became incapacitated without a legal next of kin in place lost his decision-making authority over his own assets to the family board. Richard Holt had been waiting 11 years for a seat at that table. 11 years of watching his younger brother outperform him, outmaneuver him, outthink him at every turn. And now Daniel was unconscious, and there was a legal window that Richard intended to walk straight through. But there was a problem. Daniel had recently changed his personal will. Not the trust, just his personal documentation. And in that document, he had included a clause that his attorney later described as unusual. If Daniel ever became incapacitated, his personal estate and medical decision rights would pass not to his family, but to his legal spouse, if he had one. If he did not, a legal guardian would need to be appointed through the courts, a process that could take months and during which Richard would have no authority at all. Richard needed Daniel to have a wife, fast, and legally, before any court proceedings could begin. Maya Chen had not been chosen randomly. That is the part of this story that changes everything when you understand it. She had grown up 3 blocks from the Holt family's original neighborhood on the north side of Chicago, before money moved them somewhere cleaner and quieter. Her father, James Chen, had run a small logistics company for 20 years, a company that had, 8 years ago, taken a significant contract loan from a Holt Capital subsidiary, a loan that had been quietly restructured twice, a loan that Eleanor Holt now held the full terms of. Maya's father did not know that the woman who had been so gracious at their refinancing meetings was the mother of the man whose company effectively owned his debt. He found out the same week Daniel went into the coma. He found out because Eleanor made sure he did. The offer to Maya came through a lawyer. Formal, almost clinical. Marry Daniel Holt in a private legal ceremony, sign the documents, become his legal next of kin. In exchange, her father's loan would be forgiven in full. Every cent. $214,000 gone. Her father would keep his business, his house, his retirement. All Maya had to do was sign her name next to a man who could not sign his own. She had 72 hours to decide. She spent the first night sitting on the floor of her apartment bathroom because it was the only room small enough to make her feel like the walls weren't moving. She spent the second day trying to find a lawyer who would tell her there was another option. There wasn't, not one that protected her father in time. On the third morning, she put on the consignment shop dress and she signed the papers. What happened in the weeks that followed was not what Richard Holt had planned. Maya, as Daniel's legal spouse, now had full medical decision-making rights. And the first decision she made was to bring in a second neurological team, independent physicians who had no relationship with the Holt family and no financial stake in Daniel's outcome. She did this not out of suspicion at first, just out of the stubborn practicality of someone who had grown up watching her father negotiate every contract twice because the first version always favored the other side. The second team reviewed Daniel's treatment protocol and found something the first team had not prioritized. A specific type of pressure management therapy that had shown strong results in cases with similar injury profiles. Not experimental, just not the approach currently being used. Eleanor Holt was furious. Richard Holt threatened legal action, which his own attorney quietly told him he had no grounds for. Maya was the legal next of kin. She had every right. She made the call. The new protocol began on a Thursday morning in late October, 41 days after the accident. 41 days after Maya had stood in that hospital room with her wet bouquet and her cold ring and her $43. On a Sunday night 11 days later, Daniel Holt opened his eyes. He did not know who she was. That is the part that breaks you when you sit with it long enough. He woke up to find a woman he had never met sitting beside his bed, a woman who introduced herself as his wife, a woman who then had to explain as calmly as she could everything that had happened while he was gone. The accident, the coma, the family trust clause, his brother's plan, the loan over her father's head, the dress from the consignment shop, all of it. She told him everything because she had decided, somewhere in those 11 days of sitting beside a stranger's bed, reading him her father's old business reports, because she did not know what else to say to an unconscious person, that she was not going to be the kind of person who built anything on a hidden foundation. Daniel listened. He did not speak for a long time after she finished. The monitors were quieter now, the machines fewer. Late afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, casting long shadows across the hospital floor. He looked at his hands for a while, then he looked at her, and what he said next is the moment this story stops being about money and power and family manipulation and becomes something else entirely. He said, "You changed my treatment protocol." Not a question. He had already been briefed by his new medical team. She nodded. He said, "My family told you not to." She nodded again. He said, "Why did you do it anyway?" And Maya Chen, who had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night for 6 weeks, who had been navigating the legal machinery of one of Chicago's wealthiest families, with no resources and no allies, and a $38 dress, looked at this man she had married and barely knew and said the only honest thing she had left. Because it was the right call, and because nobody else was going to make it. This is the kind of story that the people who cover wealth and power never quite capture, and it is exactly why those of us at Shadowlight Stories keep digging past the headlines. Because the real story is never the money. It is never the coma or the recovery or the legal documents. The real story is always about what a person does when the cost of doing the right thing is higher than almost anyone would reasonably pay. Daniel Holt spent 3 weeks in rehabilitation. During that time, he and Maya talked every day. Not about the marriage, not about the legal situation or what happened next. They talked about his company, because she had been receiving his briefings as next of kin and had started to understand the structure of Holt Capital in ways that surprised even her. They talked about her father's logistics business, because Daniel knew the industry, and she knew her father's operation better than anyone. They talked about the night of the accident, which Daniel remembered in fragments: a wet road, headlights, the strange calm of impact. They talked about the trust clause and how Daniel had always known it was there and had always meant to address it and had kept putting it off the way people put off the things that remind them of their own mortality. What they did not talk about, not directly, not yet, was what the marriage meant now that the reason for it had technically passed. Daniel was awake. He was recovering. He could make his own decisions. Maya had fulfilled whatever obligation the Holts had constructed around her, and she was legally free to file for an annulment and walk away. Her father's loan had been forgiven. The document was signed. She had done everything she had agreed to do. She did not file. He did not ask her to, and neither of them mentioned it for 17 days. The conversation that finally happened took place not in the hospital, and not in any of the formal settings that had defined their entire relationship so far. It happened in a parking garage on a Wednesday afternoon when Daniel had his first approved outdoor excursion, and they had stopped at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital and then walked back in light rain because neither of them had thought to bring an umbrella. They stood beside Maya's 10-year-old Honda in the parking structure, both slightly damp, holding paper coffee cups, and Daniel said, "I want to talk about what you want to do." And Maya said, "I've been thinking about that." And there was a pause long enough that a car drove past them and turned a corner somewhere below. Then she said, "I don't actually know yet. Is that a strange answer?" And Daniel said, "No. It's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I can remember." What followed over the next several months was not a fairy tale. It would be easier and more satisfying to tell you it was. 2 people thrown together by manipulation and money, falling cleanly and completely into love, the billionaire grateful and transformed, the young woman's sacrifices rewarded with exactly the life she deserved. That version of this story exists in movies. Real life is slower and more careful and more interesting than that. What actually happened was a negotiation. A long, honest, sometimes uncomfortable negotiation between two people trying to figure out what was real between them once all the manufactured circumstances fell away. Daniel restructured the Holt family trust himself, with new legal counsel, cutting out the clause his grandfather had written and replacing it with language that protected his autonomy regardless of his marital status. He did this publicly and without warning his family, which cost him months of difficult conversations with Eleanor and effectively ended whatever relationship remained between him and Richard. He also made a separate legal move that no one in his circle expected. He transferred full ownership of Maya's father's loan forgiveness into a permanent legal document that could never be reversed regardless of what happened to the marriage. He made sure James Chen's business was protected, not because Maya was his wife, but because what had been done to that man was wrong, and Daniel Holt had the ability to make it right. Maya went back to finish her graduate degree in urban planning, which she had interrupted 2 years earlier when money got tight. She did this while navigating the social landscape of being married to Daniel Holt, which was its own education entirely. She sat across from people at dinners who looked at her the way people look at something they have not yet categorized. She handled it the way she handled the hospital board and Richard's lawyers and Eleanor's cold courtesy, with patience, with precision, without apology. They are still married, not because they had to be, because they chose to be, quietly, without announcement, on a regular Tuesday, when Daniel asked her what she actually wanted, and she told him the truth, and the truth turned out to be something they both recognized. Think about what this story actually shows you. Not the romance, not the wealth. Think about what Maya did in those 11 days before Daniel woke up. She had no power. She had no money. She had been placed in an impossible position by people who assumed she was manageable because she was young and broke and scared. And she sat beside a stranger's bed every single day, and she learned everything she could, and she made the one decision that changed his outcome, not because anyone told her to, but because she could see it was right. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a $38 dress reading quarterly reports to an unconscious man at 2 in the morning because she decided that if she was going to be in this room, she was going to understand it. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments below. If you had been Maya, standing in that hospital room on your wedding day, married to a stranger, with your family's security on the line, what would you have done differently? Not what you wish the situation had been. What would you actually have done? Because I think that question tells you something real about yourself, and I think this story is worth sitting with long enough to answer it honestly. If someone in your life needs to hear a story about what quiet courage actually looks like, share this with them today, not because it is just a good story, though it is, but because the people around us are sometimes standing in rooms we do not know about, making decisions we will never see, holding things together in ways nobody will think to thank them for. Sharing this might be the closest thing to telling them you see them. Some doors open because someone forces them, and some doors open because someone stood in front of them long enough, quietly enough, and patiently enough that the lock eventually gave way on its own.